but rather a special city that was set aside to be the capital and doesn't really have a lot else going for it beyond a bunch of government buildings. Sorry, Ottawa. Canada uses a parliamentary system as its system of government, based on the style of government that they use in England. The National Legislature of Canada, located in this iconic building in Ottawa, is officially just called Parliament. In Canada's parliamentary system, the Prime Minister is chosen on the basis of which political party can get the most seats elected to the Parliament in a national election. All of the provinces use a smaller scale version of this same system to pick their own prime ministers, or premiers. Canada has courts, and if one makes a ruling you don't like, you can appeal to a higher court and try again. The highest court in the entire country is the Supreme Court of Canada. It only hears the most important cases, and since it has the final say on all legal questions, its rulings can often dramatically alter Canadian law. The Prime Minister appoints the judges of the Supreme Court, who serve until age 75. Canadian politics mostly revolves around three big political parties: the Conservatives, the Liberals, and the New Democratic Party, or NDP. The Conservatives and the Liberals are the biggest ones, and they are the only parties that have ever won a Canadian election. The NDP, which is the further left party, almost always finishes in third place nationally, but has been more successful in provincial politics. Canadian political parties are very hierarchical, and each one has a single leader who more or less single-handedly decides what the party stands for. In Canadian parliamentary elections, the party leaders stand as candidates for Prime Minister. Quebec is the only province of Canada where most of the population consists of people of French heritage who speak French rather than English. A lot of French Canadians feel that they are just too different from the rest of Canada, and for many decades there has been an active political movement pushing for Quebec to separate and become its own country. This is considered a major existential threat to Canada, and curbing Quebec separatism has been treated as a leading priority of the Canadian government over the years. Color plays a very big role in Canadian political culture, with all of the major political parties associated with one of the major colors of the rainbow. Metaphors and jokes involving colors are a very common part of Canadian political conversation. Level 2. So for most of its modern existence, Canada has functioned as a self-governing British colony, and even after securing complete independence from Great Britain in 1982, the Canadian political system still recognizes the British King or Queen as the country's highest political authority and head of state. This is an entirely symbolic thing. King Charles has no actual power over Canada, even though the Canadian political system still uses a lot of old-fashioned colonial language that makes it sound like he does. Every Canadian law begins with the phrase, "His Majesty enacts as follows," for instance. The King's representative in Canada is the Governor-General, who does various ceremonial head of state type things on the King's behalf. He or she is a non-partisan person who gets appointed by the Prime Minister as recognition for their life of public service, but I would say that most governor-generals aren't particularly well known to the Canadian public unless you're a real politics junkie. So what is commonly called the Constitution of Canada is really two documents: the Constitution Act 1867, also known as the British North America Act, which explains how the Canadian political system works, and the Constitution Act 1982, which lays out the civil rights that all Canadians enjoy, as well as the process for amending the Constitution. As you can tell from the names, the 1867 part was written in the year 1867, which is when Canada became a self-governing colony of Great Britain, while the 1982 part was written in 1982, which is the year that Canada achieved complete independence. Even though they are two separate documents, they are collectively referred to as the Constitution. A constitutional monarchy is a political system where the nominal head of the state is a royal person who doesn't have any actual political power, but may still go through the motions of formally granting royal approval to decisions of the elected government. In Canada, the Governor-General, as representative of the King, grants what is known as royal assent to every law passed by the Parliament and every decree issued by the Prime Minister. She is also the person who formally recognizes the winner of a Canadian election and inaugurates that person as Prime Minister. It has been nearly 100 years since a Governor-General has ever said no to a Prime Minister, but people continue to be fascinated by the possibility that that could maybe happen again someday if the situation was dire enough. The Bloc Québécois is a Quebec separatist political party that is usually the third largest party in the Canadian Parliament. Officially, it is a protest party that only runs in Quebec and gives Quebecers who don't believe in the idea of being part of Canada something to vote for in Canadian parliamentary elections. These days, however, it mostly just functions as a fairly normal left-of-center political party and doesn't really talk about separatism all that much. Because the Bloc is so narrowly Quebec-focused, it doesn't tend to make a lot of national news, and I would say that many Canadians forget it even exists, except for during election time. It's kind of debatable whether or not it should be considered Canada's third-place party. Like I said, it often finishes third place in the parliamentary seat count, but the NDP usually places third place in the popular vote. Following a Canadian election, we say that one of two outcomes has occurred. There was either a majority government elected, which means that one party won control of the majority of seats in the parliament, or there was a minority government elected in which the winning party only won a plurality of seats. Or in other words, the largest party is still outnumbered by the combined total of the other parties. A majority government prime minister can basically get his way 100% of the time, since his control of the parliament is so solid, but a prime minister in a minority government situation can only get his legislation passed with the support of at least one other party. The other parties can also gang up and pass a vote of no confidence in the minority government, which forces an early election. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms is perhaps the most famous part of the Canadian Constitution and comprises the bulk of the 1982 Constitution Act. As the name suggests, it lays out all of the specific human rights and freedoms that Canadians enjoy, like freedom of speech and the right to a fair trial, and it states that these privileges cannot be violated by the government. Well, most of the time. The Canadian Parliament is made up of two chambers, and both have to vote to approve all bills before they become laws. The House of Commons is the first chamber, and its members, or MPs, are elected by Canadian voters. The House of Commons is the only chamber that actually does much, and when Canadians say Parliament, they are usually referring to just the House of Commons. The second chamber is the Senate, and its members, called senators, are not elected. They are appointed by the Prime Minister whenever seats become vacant. And when do seats become vacant, you ask? Well, whenever a senator turns 75. The existence of the Senate is very controversial in Canada because it's seen as so undemocratic. There are very few countries in the world that still have an unelected House of Parliament at all. Partially for this reason, the Canadian Senate functions mostly as just a rubber stamp on things passed by the House of Commons. A lot of senators believe, in fact, that it is morally wrong for them to vote in any other way. In addition to the Big Three and the Bloc Québécois, there are two other political parties that are kinda sorta considered part of mainstream Canadian politics, even though they're quite unsuccessful. The environmentalist Green Party has been around for decades, but only started receiving substantial media attention around the mid-2000s when climate change started to become more of a bigger deal. The party has never polled particularly well, and it took ages for them to even elect one member of parliament. To a large degree, the party is held together by the charisma and media savvy of party leader Elizabeth May, who has been running the party for nearly 20 years. There is also the People's Party, which was founded by ex-conservative Maxime Bernier in 2018 and seems to be an attempt to bring a sort of European-style, harder right, anti-immigrant politics to Canada. But it also doesn't poll well and has never elected a single member of parliament. So Canada is a country that is built on land that was taken from the indigenous peoples of this continent. In many, but not all cases, their land was officially taken through treaties of surrender that the Indian leaders signed with representatives of France or England or Canada in exchange for special governance